The early morning sunlight streamed into the small but bustling town of Kure, a port city where old traditions met the hum of modern machines. Tomoko Arakawa, a 26-year-old with a fiery determination and an ever-present grease stain on her cheek, pushed open the garage door of her family-owned auto repair shop, Arakawa Motors. The familiar clang of tools and the sharp scent of motor oil filled the air. "All right, girl, another day, another engine to tame," she muttered under her breath, tying her shoulder-length black hair into a high ponytail. Her hands, calloused yet nimble, moved with precision as she grabbed a torque wrench from her neatly organized tool rack. The shop wasn't anything grand to repair bays, a small office cluttered with invoices, and a hand-painted sign that her father had made before he retired. Despite its modest size, Arakawa Motors had a reputation for quality. Mostly because of Tomoko's skill, customers trusted her judgment, even if some still raised an eyebrow when they realized their mechanic was a petite woman in coveralls. "Tomoko-chan, are you here?" A cheerful voice rang out. It was Emmy, her childhood best friend, and the unofficial gossip of Kure. She peeked around the corner, carrying 2 cans of iced coffee. "What's up, Emmy?" Tomoko called back, already half under the hood of a dusty Toyota Land Cruiser. "I heard you've got a new customer today. Some big shot guy driving a European car. Can you imagine? In this town?" Emmy grinned, handing over a can. Tomoko raised an eyebrow, wiping her hands on her already stained coveralls before cracking open the drink. "Big shot or not, if his car's busted, he's just another customer to me." She took a sip, the cold liquid a welcome contrast to the rising heat in the garage. Just as she spoke, the unmistakable growl of a high-performance engine echoed down the street. Both women turned their heads as a sleek, black Aston Martin Vantage rolled into the lot. The car looked out of place in Kure, its glossy finish gleaming like a jewel amidst the sea of K-cars and aging sedans. "Speak of the devil," Emmy whispered, her eyes wide. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall, sharp-dressed man in his early 30s. He wore a crisp navy suit, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His presence exuded wealth and confidence, but his face showed a hint of irritation as he surveyed the garage. "Is this Arakawa Motors?" he asked, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. Tomoko wiped her hands and stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Yeah, you found it. I'm Tomoko, the mechanic. What seems to be the problem?" The man's eyes flicked to her, surprise flashing across his face. "You're the mechanic?" She smirked, crossing her arms. "That a problem?" "No, just unexpected," he replied, recovering quickly. "The name's Ryo Takahashi. My car's making a strange whining noise when I accelerate. I was told this shop could handle specialized repairs." Tomoko's interest piqued. "Let me take a look." Ryo hesitated for a moment but handed her the keys. She slid into the driver's seat, the luxurious leather cradling her like a throne. "Wow," she muttered, running her fingers over the controls. The engine purred to life, and she revved it lightly, listening intently. "Hear that?" she asked, stepping out. "Sounds like a loose serpentine belt or maybe an issue with the turbocharger. I'll need to get under the hood to be sure." Ryo arched an eyebrow. "You figured that out just by listening?" Tomoko shrugged, already grabbing her tools. "Cars talk if you know how to listen." As she worked, Emmy watched from the sidelines, whispering commentary. "Did you see his shoes? Bet they cost more than my entire wardrobe." Tomoko shot her a look. "If you're not going to help, at least stay out of the way." "Fine, fine." Emmy giggled, retreating to the office. Ryo, meanwhile, hovered nearby, his initial skepticism giving way to curiosity. "So, you run this place alone?" "For the most part," Tomoko replied, tightening a bolt with practiced ease. "My dad started the shop, but he retired a few years ago. I took over." "Impressive," Ryo said, his tone genuine. "You don't see many women in this line of work." She glanced up, her dark eyes sharp. "Yeah, and you don't see many rich guys rolling into tiny garages like mine. Guess we're both full of surprises." Ryo chuckled, a rare smile softening his features. The two fell into an easy rhythm as Tomoko explained the intricacies of the repairs. Ryo, despite his polished exterior, seemed genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions. Just as she was finishing up, a loud crash echoed from the office. "Emmy?" Tomoko called, rushing over. Emmy stood amidst a pile of fallen boxes, her face red with embarrassment. "Sorry, I was looking for, something." Tomoko sighed, shaking her head. You're impossible. Rio chuckled again, leaning casually against the doorframe. She's entertaining, at least. Tomoko rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. The day was far from over, and Tomoko knew the repair would take hours. But as she returned to the Aston Martin, she felt a spark of excitement she couldn't quite explain. Tomoko slid back under the hood of the Aston Martin, her hands moving deftly as she began removing the engine cover. "Looks like the turbo system's the culprit," she muttered. "A loose connection to the compressor housing. Pretty common issue if you push the car hard enough." "Have you been driving this thing like you're on a racetrack?" Rio, standing with his arms crossed, smirked. "Maybe. What's the point of owning a car like this, if you're not going to let it stretch its legs?" Tomoko shot him a sharp look, her grease-streaked face somehow managing to convey both exasperation and amusement. "Cars like this don't come cheap to repair. Push it too far, and it'll push back hard." "Noted," Rio said, though his tone suggested he wasn't exactly planning to slow down anytime soon. As she worked, the atmosphere shifted. The faint hum of traffic outside and the occasional clink of tools created a strange but comforting rhythm. Rio, who at first seemed like the type to hover impatiently, found himself drawn in by Tomoko's focus. She worked with the precision of a surgeon, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Where'd you learn all this?" he asked after a while, genuinely curious. Tomoko paused, adjusting the light hanging from the hood. "My dad, he started teaching me when I was a kid. He said I had the hands for it." Steady, patient. Guess he was right. She glanced at Rio. "What about you? What's a guy like you doing in a place like Cure?" Rio hesitated for a moment, his confident facade slipping just slightly. "Business," he said finally. "I'm looking to expand my company's operations in smaller towns like this. But I'll admit, this place has a certain charm." "Charm, huh?" Tomoko chuckled. "That's a fancy way of saying it's old and slow. It feels real, authentic. Places like this remind me of what's important." Tomoko raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden earnestness. "You're full of surprises, Takahashi-san." "Rio," he corrected. "Just Rio." "All right, Rio," she said with a smirk. "Pass me that socket wrench, will you?" He blinked. "The what?" she sighed, pointing. "The thing that looks like this." She mimicked the motion of using the tool. "Oh, right. He grabbed the wrong one." "Not that one." Tomoko groaned, laughing despite herself. "Here, let me show you." She stepped beside him, their hands brushing as she guided him to the correct tool. For a moment, Rio seemed uncharacteristically flustered. "Got it," he said quickly, handing it over. Tomoko took it, shaking her head with a grin. "Stick to driving, big shot. Leave the fixing to me." Just then, the garage door creaked open, and an older man stepped inside. He wore a weathered jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his graying hair. "Tomoko," he called, his voice warm and familiar. "Dad?" Tomoko straightened, her face lighting up. "What are you doing here?" Kenji Arakawa, her father and the retired founder of the shop, grinned. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd see how my favorite mechanic's doing." "You mean your only mechanic?" she teased, walking over to give him a hug. Kenji's eyes shifted to Rio, his expression growing curious. "And who's this?" "Rio Takahashi." Rio introduced himself with a polite bow. "I'm a customer." Kenji studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, you're in good hands. Tomoko's the best there is." "Thanks, Dad," Tomoko said, her voice softer than usual. Kenji patted her shoulder. "I'll leave you to it. Just wanted to say hi." As he left, Tomoko watched him go with a thoughtful expression. Rio broke the silence. "Your dad seems proud of you." "He is," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough to keep his legacy alive." Rio frowned. "What do you mean?" "This shop." She gestured around them. "It's small, old. There are times I think about expanding. Maybe taking on more staff, but I don't know. It feels like I'd be losing something in the process." Rio leaned against the workbench, his gaze steady. "Change doesn't have to mean losing what's important. Sometimes it's about building on what's already there." Tomoko looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. "You sound like you've been through something similar." "Maybe," he said with a faint smile. The moment hung in the air, unspoken questions and answers passing between them. But before Tomoko could say more, the sound of a car horn outside broke the spell. "Guess I'd better finish this up," she said, turning back to the Aston Martin. Rio watched her work, a new sense of respect growing in him. There was something about Tomoko, her determination, her skill, her unpretentious confidence that made her unlike anyone he'd ever met. And though neither of them said it, they both knew this was only the beginning of a story that was far from over. Tomoko worked in silence for a few more minutes, tightening the final bolt and making sure everything was in place. Rio, meanwhile, had settled into a nearby chair, watching her with a thoughtful expression. It was clear he had begun to see her in a different light. The confident, composed woman who ran this shop with an iron grip wasn't just a mechanic. She was a force to be reckoned with. Once she finished, Tomoko wiped her hands on a rag and stood up, brushing off the dust. All right, the turbo's fixed. Shouldn't make that whining noise anymore. Rio stood and stretched, clearly impressed. I'll take your word for it, Tomoko. You really know what you're doing. Just doing my job, she replied, the usual cockiness back in her tone. The car's ready to go, but if you drive it like you did before, it might need another fix sooner than you think. Rio gave her a wry grin. I'll take it easy, I promise. He fished out his wallet and handed her a thick stack of cash. How much do I owe you? Tomoko shook her head. The standard fee is enough, Takahashi-san. I don't need extra. He raised an eyebrow at her refusal. I don't mind paying more. You've done a great job. Yeah, well, Tomoko hesitated, trying to avoid a confrontation over money. Just the usual, all right? No more, no less. Rio looked at her for a moment, sensing that she wouldn't budge. He finally sighed and accepted it, handing over the agreed amount. Fair enough. You sure you're okay with just that? Absolutely, she said, stuffing the money into the register. Now, I've got other things to do, so unless you need me for something else. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you about something, Rio said, his tone suddenly turning serious. Tomoko glanced at him, a little wary. What about? I have a project in mind, a high-end car club. I'm thinking of launching in Cure. We'd need a mechanic who knows their stuff, someone who can keep the cars in top shape. I think you'd be the perfect fit. Tomoko blinked, surprised. A car club? You want me to work for you? Rio nodded. Not work for me, but collaborate. You'd handle the mechanical side, and I'd take care of the business and promotion. It could be good for you. Get your name out there more. Tomoko considered it, her mind racing. She didn't need anyone telling her what to do, but there was something intriguing about the offer. The idea of taking her shop to the next level, of expanding beyond just the repairs. But could she really trust this guy? Before she could respond, the shop's front door opened, and a tall woman with sharp features and a commanding presence stepped inside. She wore a perfectly tailored black leather jacket, black boots, and her dark hair was tied in a no-nonsense ponytail. The air seemed to shift with her arrival, as though the entire atmosphere in the garage suddenly took on a different tone. Tomoko, I need to talk to you about something, the woman said, her voice cool and authoritative. Tomoko frowned, immediately recognizing her. Ayumi, what are you doing here? Ayumi Nakamura, Tomoko's rival and one of the most skilled mechanics in Cure, was always causing trouble. They had known each other for years, and while Tomoko respected Ayumi's talent, the two had never gotten along. There was an unspoken competition between them, a battle of who could run the best shop, who could handle the toughest jobs. I've been hearing things, Ayumi said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Rio, about you working with this guy. Careful, Tomoko. Some people have a way of pulling you into things you don't want to be part of. Rio stood up, a little taken aback by her directness. I'm Rio Takahashi, and I think you've got me confused with someone else. Ayumi looked him up and down with a hint of suspicion. I've heard about you. Rich guy. Wants to make a name for himself in the car world by playing with small shops. Thinks he can buy his way in. Tomoko immediately stepped between them, her arms raised in a defensive gesture. Ayumi, calm down. He's not like that. He just came here for a repair. Ayumi didn't back down. You sure about that? Because people like him have a habit of getting in the way of people who actually know what they're doing. You think this club he's offering is a good idea? You really trust him? Tomoko looked at Ayumi, her frustration bubbling up. This is my decision, all right? If I want to work with him, I will. Rio observed the tense exchange with interest but kept quiet. The history between Tomoko and Ayumi was palpable, the rivalry undeniable. Ayumi's gaze softened, but just slightly. Fine, do what you want, but don't come crying to me when he leaves you high and dry, like so many others. With that, she turned and walked toward the door. I'll be watching, Tomoko. Once Ayumi was gone, the shop felt strangely empty. Tomoko let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. That was intense, Rio said, watching her carefully. Yeah, she has a way of making everything feel like it's the end of the world. Tomoko replied with a small sigh. She's protective, I guess. So I'm the villain now? Rio smirked, leaning back. As the day wore on, Tomoko's mind was still buzzing with thoughts about the encounter with Ayumi, the intriguing offer from Rio, and the sudden appearance of Yuto. Things were starting to feel a bit out of control. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was unfolding right in front of her. But before she could dwell too much on it, the sound of an engine caught her attention. Not the usual hum of a car being worked on, but the unmistakable roar of a high-performance engine. The shop's door creaked open again, and in stepped yet another unfamiliar face. This one younger and carrying an aura of confidence that made the room feel a little smaller. He was in his early 20s, with messy, light brown hair and sharp, angular features. His clothes were simple: a worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and a pair of scuffed boots that seemed to carry the weight of a lot of miles. He walked in with a casual swagger, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Tomoko straightened up, wiping her hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" The guy smiled, revealing a hint of mischief in his eyes. "You must be Tomoko Arakawa. I've heard quite a bit about you." Tomoko raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? I'm Kato Suzuki," he said, offering a handshake. "I've got a bit of a problem with my car. Something with the suspension. It's throwing off the alignment, and I don't trust anyone else to fix it. I figured if anyone could handle it, it'd be you." Tomoko eyed him carefully, sensing the challenge in his tone. She shook his hand, noting his firm grip. "All right, let me take a look." Kato led her outside to a sleek Nissan 350Z parked just out front. The car had clearly seen better days. Its paint was chipped, the front bumper had a few scrapes, and the wheels were showing signs of wear. But despite the scratches, it was a beautiful machine, one that clearly had the potential for speed. As Tomoko knelt down to inspect the suspension, Kato leaned against his car, watching her every move. "I've been racing this thing for a couple of years now," he explained. "It's been through a lot, but it's my baby. I know my way around a wrench, but I trust you more than I trust myself." Tomoko smiled slightly as she examined the lower control arm. "Racing, huh? I can tell. You've got the scars to prove it." "Hey, it's all part of the fun," Kato said with a grin. "But seriously, I don't want to push it too hard until it's fixed. It's my daily driver, after all." "Let me guess," Tomoko said, "you're one of those street racers, right?" Kato's grin faded just a little, his eyes narrowing. "You could say that, but I've got more than just speed to back me up." He crossed his arms, clearly proud of the work he'd put into the car himself. Tomoko looked up from her inspection. "All right, well, I'll take care of it. Suspension's off, but it's not a huge issue." Kato watched her work, impressed. "You know, I've heard a lot about your skills, but seeing it up close is something else. You've got the touch, I'll give you that." Tomoko shrugged, focusing on the task at hand. "Everyone's got their thing. I just happen to be good with cars. Well, I've got a thing for performance, and I could use someone who knows how to get the most out of a machine like mine," Kato said, leaning in a little closer. "Maybe we could work together sometime. You and me, tuning cars, making them faster, pushing the limits." Tomoko glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "I work alone, but I'll fix your car, no strings attached." Kato didn't seem put off. "Fair enough. I like a challenge. I'll stick around and watch, if you don't mind." Tomoko smirked. "Fine, but don't get in my way." As she worked on the suspension, Kato took a seat on the nearby bench, still keeping his eyes trained on her. There was something about his presence that seemed to make the air around them more electric, more charged. Maybe it was his youthful confidence, or the way he seemed to be sizing her up, as much as she was sizing him up. Just as she finished up with the suspension, a sharp honk from outside interrupted their moment. Both Tomoko and Kato turned their heads toward the sound. "Speaking of racers," Tomoko muttered under her breath. Outside, a lowered Subaru BRZ slid into the parking lot, its engine purring like a predator. The car came to a stop, and the door opened to reveal none other than Yuto Ishida, the notorious street racer Tomoko had been talking about earlier. Yuto's smirk was almost predatory as he stepped out of the car. He was taller than both Tomoko and Kato, with a lean, athletic build. His short, spiky hair and sharp features gave him an almost intimidating presence. He was dressed in a fitted hoodie, jeans, and a pair of sleek sneakers, but his casual appearance couldn't hide the fact that he was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. Well, Yuto said, his gaze falling on Kato. I didn't expect to see you here, Suzuki. Thought you were too good for this place. Kato stood up, his expression matching Yuto's. I know better than to trust you with my car. Thought I'd bring it to someone who actually knows what they're doing. Yuto chuckled, stepping closer to the two. Is that so? Because I don't think anyone around here knows cars as well as I do. Including you, Suzuki. Tomoko, sensing the brewing tension between the two men, stepped forward and cleared her throat. All right, both of you. You're not here to start a fight, are you? Yuto's eyes narrowed as he glanced at her. Don't worry, I'm just here for a quick tune-up. No need to get your hands dirty, Tomoko. Oh, I'm not the one you should be worried about. She shot back with a teasing grin. But I'll help you out anyway. I'm sure your car needs more work than you realize. Yuto raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to stand her ground. We'll see about that. He tossed her the keys to his BRZ, and without another word, Tomoko slipped into the driver's seat, already feeling the familiar excitement of working on a new challenge. She fired up the engine, listening to the hum of the turbocharged boxer engine. Kato leaned against his car, watching her with interest. You two have a history, don't you? Tomoko glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and amusement. You could say that. Yuto thinks he's the king of the streets, but he's never met someone who knows cars better than he does. As she turned the key and popped the hood of the BRZ, she noticed the telltale signs of Yuto's reckless driving. The exhaust system had been tampered with, and the suspension was way too stiff for daily use. Just like I thought, she muttered. You don't take care of your car, Yuto? Yuto shrugged, unfazed. I just drive it. It's meant to be fast, not pretty. Tomoko grinned. Well, let's see if I can make it both. Outside, a lowered Subaru BRZ slid into the parking lot, its engine purring like a predator. The car came to a stop, and the door opened to reveal none other than Yuto Ishida, the notorious street racer Tomoko had been talking about earlier. Yuto's smirk was almost predatory as he stepped out of the car. He was taller than both Tomoko and Kato, with a lean, athletic build. His short, spiky hair and sharp features gave him an almost intimidating presence. He was dressed in a fitted hoodie, jeans, and a pair of sleek sneakers. But his casual appearance couldn't hide the fact that he was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. Well, Yuto said, his gaze falling on Kato. I didn't expect to see you here, Suzuki. Thought you were too good for this place. Kato stood up, his expression matching Yuto's. I know better than to trust you with my car. Thought I'd bring it to someone who actually knows what they're doing. Yuto chuckled, stepping closer to the two. Is that so? Because I don't think anyone around here knows cars as well as I do. Including you, Suzuki. Tomoko, sensing the brewing tension between the two men, stepped forward and cleared her throat. All right, both of you. You're not here to start a fight, are you? Yuto's eyes narrowed as he glanced at her. Don't worry, I'm just here for a quick tune-up. No need to get your hands dirty, Tomoko. Oh, I'm not the one you should be worried about. She shot back with a teasing grin. But I'll help you out anyway. I'm sure your car needs more work than you realize. Yuto raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to stand her ground. We'll see about that. He tossed her the keys to his BRZ, and without another word, Tomoko slipped into the driver's seat, already feeling the familiar excitement of working on a new challenge. She fired up the engine, listening to the hum of the turbocharged boxer engine. Kato leaned against his car, watching her with interest. You two have a history, don't you? Tomoko glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and amusement. You could say that. Yuto thinks he's the king of the streets, but he's never met someone who knows cars better than he does. As she turned the key and popped the hood of the BRZ, she noticed the telltale signs of Yuto's reckless driving. The exhaust system had been tampered with, and the suspension was way too stiff for daily use. Just like I thought, she muttered. You don't take care of your car, Yuto? Yuto shrugged, unfazed. I just drive it. It's meant to be fast, not pretty. Tomoko grinned. Well, let's see if I can make it both. Tomoko popped the hood of Yuto's Subaru BRZ and immediately began to assess the situation. The car's engine was purring, but there was something off about the way it sounded rougher, less refined. As she worked her way through the exhaust system, she noticed that it wasn't just the suspension that needed attention. The engine had been tuned recklessly, and the timing was off. You've been pushing this too hard, Tomoko muttered, inspecting the intake manifold. I can fix it, but you're going to have to learn to take care of it if you want it to last. Yuto, standing with his arms crossed, watched her closely, his eyes narrowing. I know how to drive, Tomoko. I don't need a lecture on car care. Tomoko didn't respond immediately. She had heard that same line before from street racers, too proud to admit their mistakes. She decided it was better to let her work speak for itself. As the hours passed, Tomoko meticulously adjusted the engine's timing, realigned the suspension, and gave the exhaust system the attention it desperately needed. By the time she was done, the car was humming like a well-oiled machine, but more importantly, it was safe to drive. She wiped her hands on a rag and stood back, looking at the car with a sense of accomplishment. There, now your car can go fast and last. Yuto stared at the car for a moment, before getting into the driver's seat and firing the engine up. The change was immediately noticeable. The engine was smoother, the handling was more stable, and the power was delivered more efficiently. Not bad, Arakawa, Yuto said, a small smile playing on his lips for the first time. I guess I underestimated you. Tomoko raised an eyebrow. You think? Kato, who had been leaning against his own car, smirked. I told you she knew what she was doing. Yuto gave Kato a sideways glance before turning back to Tomoko. I'll admit I was wrong. Maybe there's more to cars than just speed. Tomoko nodded, her voice softer now. Speed doesn't mean anything if you don't know how to take care of what's beneath the hood. Cars aren't just about pushing limits. They're about knowing how far you can go safely. Yuto hesitated before replying, his usual cockiness subdued. You're right. Maybe I need to take things a little slower. I've been focusing too much on winning and not enough on keeping my car in shape. Tomoko smiled, nodding. You'll get there. Yuto, it's not about being the fastest, it's about being the smartest. Kato, who had been quiet for a while, chuckled. Looks like you just taught him a lesson, Tomoko. Tomoko shrugged, not one for taking credit. It's not about teaching, just about showing that the best things come with patience and understanding. As the day came to a close, the tension that had been between the three of them seemed to dissolve. Yuto, usually the lone wolf, found himself with a newfound respect for Tomoko and her craft. Kato, who had once seemed like just another racer, was beginning to understand that there was more to the world of cars than just modifications and fast times. Tomoko, too, felt a sense of peace. Despite the rivalries and the occasional clash of egos, she was reminded that passion for what you do, combined with a willingness to learn, was what truly set the best apart from the rest. Moral of the story: in a world that often prioritizes speed and results, it's important to remember that true success comes from understanding the process and respecting the journey. Whether it's with cars, relationships, or any craft, the key to lasting success is taking care of the things that matter, learning from your mistakes, and having the patience to grow. Sometimes the best way to win isn't by being the fastest, but by being the most careful, considerate, and thoughtful along the way.